In this lesson, we're going to learn how to sculpt the running water using NURMS mesh smoothing. So the water we're talking about is everything that is going to be flowing off this top edge of the pool down into this gutter, if you would call it, just below. And that's going to give us that infinity pool edge that we really want to have in these type of scenarios where we have this beautiful sea view. So what we're going to do first of all is just check that this entire edge is at the right height. Now I'm going to go and look at my section, and in the front view I'm just going to adjust the height of this. So I need to move it slightly down just till it sinks in there and basically lines up with my CAD information. Then I'm going to go back into my 3D view and I'm just going to make the last couple of adjustments to the actual points around this part of the pool. So I'm going to select all of these lines that basically trace around. You can also use loop, and that will basically just scoop around. And then I'm going to take that edge and just move it down until it snaps onto this inner edge of the pool. So this is basically now forming the main container of the pool. Also the level of the water, in other words the height of the water, is going to be slightly lower. I can look at that height on my elevation. It's going to be at this height. So the height is actually this one here, and the water would come to this point and then run off here. So that's exactly what we want to do. We want to take this water, we want to drag it all the way to this edge, and then make sure that it's just slightly over that edge. So let's just move it so that it's a few millimeters above. So that's our water running over this edge. So the same thing, in other words, stretching that water out needs to be done in the side view. So we've done it in the front view. Now let's go to the side, and we want to do the same thing. We just want to stretch it ever so slightly over that edge. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to start working on this rim flow pool edge. So first, let's go ahead and just create the basic form of it. And we're going to do this by ordinary poly modeling, and we're going to do it as one single object, not a swept object or anything else, because you could, of course, just in the same way that we modeled the profile of this drain area, we could also model a smooth curve as that water is flowing over the edge, and we could just sweep that across. But instead I'm going to do something slightly different. I'm going to hold down Shift, and I'm basically going to start modeling this as a single individual object. So you just need to be quite aware of what you are doing in terms of 3D, so you get a good looking profile. That's really the main idea here, is you want to get this angle of the water to look quite realistic. So you can look at a couple of references if that helps. So the idea here is exactly that. You want to just take those edges, move them down, move them out slightly, and get that edge looking the way you want it to. So I'm going to do this one last time, stretch it all the way down to here, and that's going to basically just create this smooth, watery edge. Then I'm going to take that object that I've just created, I'm going to deselect it, so just select the polys that you want to deselect, and then hit the detach button, not deselect but detach rather. And with that object now, let's go and start working on it. I'm going to change the color to make it look more watery. Do the same to this one. And I'm going to start adding a couple of polys. Now a good idea is to add an extra editable poly modifier on top of that, just in case the water doesn't look realistic enough and you want to go back and change things. So let's go and add one single connection of lines, and I'm going to now just use the make planar button to straighten those out. And I'm going to now just add a whole lot of detail with quite a high density of segments. So I think more or less that should be fine. And I'm going to repeat that over here. So another way that you can make everything planar is just by scaling it. You can just grab the X value and just keep scaling it until it looks flat. This is just a slightly quicker way instead of scrolling down and pressing X. And I'm going to now do the same thing here where I add a whole lot of segments in. So now we have a slightly more detailed object. The next step is to give it a little bit of play. So this you can do either manually, you can grab a few vertices, and this can be time consuming because you're basically sculpting one vertex at a time. You can also use the paint tool that we looked at when we were sculpting the mesh for the site. So that is also a possibility. And let's just go and move these edges, or rather these vertices, out slightly. We can do the same thing to this side. And I'm just going to keep repeating and doing this until I get more and more detail. So right now I'm doing this at a very low poly version, and then I'm going to add another level of detail. So I'm going to continue now. I'm going to pause the video and continue off screen, just doing a continuation of this where I move some of these polys or these vertices around, but the ones that I'm not going to move around are these ones that are connecting up to my main body of water. Those are the ones that you want to leave still, because you don't want to see any tears or gaps in between this running water and the flat water that is on top. So I'm going to pause now, and then we'll come back once the rest of these vertices have all been moved around in a slightly organic way. So now the rest of the vertices have been moved into the right position, or at least into a more organic position. You never really know if it's perfectly right. So if I just zoom in here, you'll see what I've done. I've just manually gone and moved them around to give a slightly more organic look to that water. So that is purely simply what has happened. You could also go and use a noise modifier and just add some noise to that, but I rather use the noise for the top body of water. It tends to work a little bit better. Next, what we're going to do is add a mesh smoothing. So let's just go into the modifier stack and add that. So you can just type in ME and then go to mesh smooth, press enter, and you'll see that you have a NURMS subdivision method, and you can basically start increasing or decreasing the number of iterations. So now if you have a look at what the result is, you can see that you have a very light veil, which almost looks like a sheet of material, or basically you want to make it look as though the water is flowing, but not too vigorously. So you don't necessarily want to have a zigzag effect. You want to just have a very clean, smooth veil of water going over the edge. So next we're going to add some more detail to the top face of the water, which is a separate object. So let's go and tessellate it. So TES, enter. And the one thing that you want to do just before you tessellate is you want to try and get your original poly underneath to have relatively square looking polys. So I'm going to add these two divisions into it so that once I tessellate it, the tessellation always stays more or less square. Just reduce your tension to 0 since you don't need it, and you can now add the iterations as you wish. So with a full amount of 4 iterations, the next thing to do is to add a very light bit of noise. So a noise modifier, just NOI, and you can just hit enter. And then you can generally pull down the scale to about 5 to 20%, and then the Z will be the amount of amplitude in your noise. So here I just generally have about 1 centimeter. You really want to have as little as possible, since having very bumpy water doesn't look like the weather is very good. It looks either windy or stormy, and that doesn't always look very good in the final renders. So getting just a slight curvature is fantastic, because it's going to deform the building as it reflects in this body of water. So that is pretty much it for the water sculpting. You can go and add a little bit more detail or higher resolution if you want, but I just showed you the principle so that you understand more or less how the base form is created. And most of the magic will actually happen in the texturing phase, where you want to add a texture onto this separate object, this one here, with a texture of water actually falling down. And that texture has to be done quite precisely so that you get the right amount of transparency, opacity, and so forth. So we're going to do that later on in the course, so hang on for that. And for now, we've basically completed this water on the outside. The next lesson will be about the hardscaping that happens around here, as well as some of the local site mesh smoothing and sculpting that's going to happen as we sculpt our garden around this pool area. So that's going to be done in the next lesson.